please to post questions. We're asking audience members, please, to post questions in the chat rather than taking up panel time and asking them out loud. So over to you, David, if you would like to share your screen and take it away. David, thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. And can everyone see that okay? Just before we go on. Yeah, great. And thanks to Greg for the introduction, and thanks again to Ryan for kind of organising what hopefully will be a really interesting session. So yeah, this research or this presentation is built on research that's ongoing with my colleague Deborah Hann at Cardiff, who sadly can't be here. She's I think currently under canvas for a family camping trip, which coincides with her son's birthday. So any hard questions, I'll direct you to her email at the end of the presentation. So in terms of, this will be a kind of something of a whistle-stop sort of tour of some of our kind of current thinking and research findings. And the first kind of bit of background really, which won't be a surprise to anyone, I guess, in this room, is that conflict remains a common feature of UK workplaces, according to our research and other research undertaken by the CIPD and the CBI, for example. But it tends to be, you know, with about 2/3 of organisations reporting low-level kind of disputes, which are typically resolved informally. About, again, a similar number, about 60% of respondents saying that they had instigated disciplinary proceedings in the previous kind of 5-year period. But what is particularly interesting, and 15% of respondents saying that they'd found, or that they'd ended up in an employment tribunal, again, in the preceding 5 years. What is perhaps noteworthy is the virtual disappearance of collective or group disputes. They are, you know, increasingly rare in the UK, at least. So our survey kind of concluded just before the pandemic hit, sort of in 2019, and was sponsored by or funded by ACAS and the Labour Relations Agency, which are the public dispute resolution agencies in in Britain and Northern Ireland, respectively. And so we did sort of parallel surveys and received nearly 700 completed responses. And our methodology was to kind of build on and extend that done by Bill Roach and Paul Teague when they looked at the Republic of Ireland in 2008. And the research questions we're kind of trying to pose at this stage really is, firstly, what is the prevalence of ADR in the UK? Roach and Teague found in Ireland, you know, 10 years ago or 15 years ago now nearly, that there hadn't been much transference across the Atlantic, that the practices that are fairly common in the US and Canada, etc., were relatively rare over in Ireland. So we wanted to test whether that was the true in the UK. We wanted to look whether there is a link between conflict management and broader HR, whether there is any evidence for this kind of strategic element of conflict management, that it kind of aligns with a broader sort of HR approach. And if so, what are the organizational characteristics that are associated with this kind of strategic orientation? So being conscious of time, if we dive into the findings, and I apologize for the relatively small font. So first of all, in terms of the prevalence of ADR, what we asked two sort of series of questions around a list of over 20 different practices, which could be defined as kind of being to do with dispute resolution. And we separated them into kind of what we call traditional forms of dispute resolution. These are the two at the top, which are kind of hierarchical forms where disputes are resolved at progressively higher levels of organizational hierarchy, and that where there might be a right to appeal organizational decisions. Then the second band is what we could call kind of, if you like, private ADR, what Lynch called private ADR, the idea of kind of a front end, internally focused kind of attempts to kind of nip conflicts in the bud. So that could be internal mediation, but it could also be formalized open door policies, conflict coaching, discussions with HR, those kind of practices. And then finally, at the bottom, what we would call, or what perhaps more commonly understood as public ADR, that is the involvement of a third party, whether that be ACAS or the LRA, a public dispute resolution agency, or another third-party organization. It could be lawyers, it could be professional HR consultants, etc. Now, what these bars show us is that in terms of what practices, or sorry, what policies are written down in a formalized conflict management policy, that overwhelmingly they are traditional in nature. That private and especially public ADR is relatively uncommon in organizational conflict management policies. But interestingly, when you add in what all respondents said that they had actually used in the preceding 5 years, that the actual practice of ADR is much more common. So that there seems to be a mismatch between what policy on the one hand and the actual use or prevalence of all forms of ADR, especially this kind of private internal ADR, but also the public third-party ADR as well. So that's something that we'll return to, but it belies the importance, perhaps, or the significance of ADR, that if you just looked at policies, you would underestimate perhaps the use of these policies in the UK. So in order to try and then link to the second question and to look at whether or not there was a link between conflict management practice and some form of HR orientation or broader kind of strategic HR, then we looked at, the survey also asked about the use of kind of what might be called high performance work practices. And we asked, I think, about 13, the most kind of common 9, which were kind of, meaningfully used by the respondents reported here. And what the light bars show is that the proportion of organizations using those practices where no mediation has taken place. So we're now defining ADR in its kind of most restrictive definition as just mediation. And that could be private internal mediation or through ACAS or another third party. And in total, around 45% of organizations, so nearly half the sample, had reported using some form of mediation in the preceding 5-year period. Whereas the dark blue bars are those organizations, again, the respective use of those HR practices where mediation has taken place. And in 6 of those 9 practices, the ones with the asterisk there, you can see that the use of these HR practices is more common where mediation has also been used. And that's statistically significant.
You're at 7 minutes, David.
That's okay, thanks, Greg. So what we think is this is indicative of, or perhaps of a potential link between conflict management and HR, broader HR. And if we look at the kind of the organizational characteristics of those of the firms using both mediation and mediation with high performance work practices, then organizational size is strongly associated. Now, we don't know, we haven't fully unpicked whether that's because larger organizations have greater experience of conflict and therefore have reactively kind of developed conflict management practices, or whether there is a kind of an organizational resource kind of going on here, that they have the resources to be more proactive. But we're hoping to kind of detangle that. Industrial sector seems to have no significant effect. What is important, and even controlling for size, is the existence of a specialist HR function. Okay, so the existence of a specialist, whether it be especially an internal dedicated HR function, is strongly associated with both the use of ADR or mediation and the use of ADR with high performance work practices. And there is a weak positive association between unionization rates and the use of ADR, but not with a more broader kind of what we might call strategic conflict management approach. So really, to wrap up our conclusions, and again, as we said, this is a very kind of a whistle-stop tour, is that there is evidence for some strategic conflict management in the UK, we think, and that certainly the use of ADR practices, especially these private internal ones, are fairly widespread. And there is also some indicative association between the use of these ADR practices and broader HR practices that we see as well. Interestingly, though, because of this clear distinction between what's written in policy and what's actually enacted in practice, in the practice of conflict management, that does raise questions of whether conflict management is truly strategic in nature or is merely reactive. The firms don't kind of espouse or plan to be strategic in their conflict management, but they merely react to conflict as it evolves. And again, there seems to be a key role played by specialist HR. So what this clearly, there are certain relationships here to be unpicked, which will, and thanks Greg for the kind of for the trail of the research volume next year. These will be unpicked in the written version of this research. But also we need further case study research to try and unpick some of these relationships in a bit more detail. And we're currently bidding for some funding from ACAS to do exactly that in the next year or so. So hopefully I'm under the 10 minutes, and I'll any questions, then please ask in the chat or feel free to email me, or especially Deborah if they're hard questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. And we're saving up questions till the end or in the chat. And Julian, if you'd like to share your slides, Julian Teicher, CQ University, the campus that's in Melbourne, Australia. Take it away, Julian.
I'm hoping you are able to see my screen.
Yep, my screen's fine. Good, thanks, Julian.
So, yeah, well, thank you very much for having us here. The us is in fact me along with Bernadine van Gramberg and Greg, and we've been working together for some time now around voice and conflict, and this was I guess an opportunistic intervention to do this little study, which is really an ongoing piece of work. And in doing this, we set out to use a number of IR, employee relations concepts, to understand what was going on under COVID. And it's taken us in unexpected directions, and I guess it still will. Very important, though, to say in opening, is that we've focused less on just looking at the minutiae or what happens in particular countries than trying to take a country, but trying to think about this in an international way, and not being too locked into the local. And for us and for all of you, of course, COVID has really brought about I guess some very unexpected forms of conflict, unexpected responses, and I guess the key point here really is that we've seen some workers exert unexpected power or exert their power, and other workers have been shown the vulnerability has been revealed and intensified. So I won't dilly-dally much on the opening slides. I guess everyone is familiar with the terminology of the field, but worth highlighting the definitions we're using, or at least the operating definitions for us. And actors, we have defined broadly because the field has evolved somewhat over time. And frames, again, is now become a difficult one, because although frames of reference have been with industrial relations for 50, 60 years, more perhaps, more in fact, the reality is that the usages are differing today. So thought we'd nail our colours to the mast here and say that frames are not just an ideology or whatever, but they're quite important ways which drive the way people think and see the world and ultimately inform their actions. So we do these are the questions that we're focusing on, and we obviously don't resolve fully here today. Firstly, are frames still relevant to understanding conflict and its resolution? And the COVID experience suggests to us, of course, that frames may not be unchanging. We've seen things we didn't expect. how do we accommodate the community in frames? It's something which has been floating around for about 15, 20 years, the community, not the community itself, but the way in which community may cause us to rethink frames. Second major question is, do we need to move beyond employee voice? And this is really prompted by the way in which social media played such a powerful role in some places, some societies, in shaping the response to COVID by workers. The third question, has the state been neglected as an actor? And there I think COVID reminded us of how strongly the state may intervene in some cases to change the way the game is being played, so to speak. And what can we learn from COVID about the efficacy and necessity of dispute resolution systems? And there's been a lot written on dispute resolution under COVID. It's been a fertile area, but then we see gaps too. So we focus in our work so far on two kinds of conflicts: the virtual workplace conflicts, because COVID has brought virtual or remote work to the fore in a way which we have not hitherto seen. I think it's been quite remarkable. And the second one set of conflicts we focused on were the ones or are focusing on are ones in the real workplace, the physical workplace, and the issues around intensified workload, stress, burnout, and so forth. So the next two slides highlight, of course, those kinds of conflicts that we're talking about. And just use a couple of graphics there, which highlight the fact that the resistance to return to work and the way in which that has been resolved in some places, of course, by mass resignation rather than return to the work, but also by the rise of the hybrid workplace. Both these graphics are US-based, of course, highlighting that resistance. The second one is about workers in healthcare considering leaving, and that's been again US-based data, but suggestive of the high levels of resistance to remaining in the workplace because of the pressures of work, and that does open up questions about conflict and resolution when people engage in large-scale exit. So, in categorizing these conflicts, then we suggest that firstly, conflicts can transition from individual to collective, and that's something that would not be surprising in an old IR world, an old industrial relations world, but more surprising in the present world, I guess, because of the absence of unions, or not the absence, but in many societies, unions are not prevalent in the way in which they were. But what we've seen is nonetheless individual conflicts being amplified, being expressed through the use of social media and mass communication media. And in that way, they become collective, more coherently expressed, and that sometimes paves the way to a response to bring about change. But it makes us also think about the frames and how they operate, and certainly for us, the neo-pluralist frame and how adequate that might be.
Julian, you're at 7 minutes, Julian.
Thanks, Greg. And the other aspect there is conflicts moving from covert to overt, and again, being amplified by social media and such. But it also leads then to possible crystallization of new themes of, and we're in the early stages there. So what of actors, frames, and dispute resolution? What we get to is the state. We saw the state in many cases intervening, and sometimes intervening not in the interests seemingly of the people, but more of, let's keep the economy alive, let's keep the economy open. But the state just fractured the illusion, I think, that workplace conflict was something which was for the actors. In fact, the state's interventions changed the dynamic. So the actors were reacting and the disputes were being sometimes shaped by the state, but the state wasn't necessarily helping in resolving those disputes. A lot of employer action, the control, surveillance stuff going on in remote work highlights the old unitarist model, but the worker resistance efforts suggest a pluralist frame, and as I've already suggested, we also think more productive to look at pluralism. But this finally is not to say sorry. This is not to say that a single frame of reference is relevant, rather that multiple frames are likely to be relevant, and certainly new frames, and those need to take into account the prevalence of care work and non-profits in modern economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. And now over to New Zealand. Erling, take it away. Would you like to share your screen, Erling?
Should be here, shouldn't it? So in fact, I'm sitting in Denmark, but that doesn't matter. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Erling, you might want to go into slideshow mode or presenter mode, because at the moment we're seeing you in your editing mode.
That one here, or just hold on. Just getting that back. Slideshow. So basically, this is a paper that I've done with Gaye, Greenwood and Yashika, Chandhok. What I think is really interesting about this paper is two things. First of all, the type of research insight that we are bringing forward here. These are things we worked on for 5, 6, 7 years, and it hasn't really appeared much in the literature. And in particular, we do some in-depth research on disputes in schools, and we bring in practitioners' experiences. And I should say that the lead author, Gaye Greenwood, is now, she's a former colleague of mine, but now she's a mediator working in the field. So that is, I think, one of the big things, bringing in some new insights that you haven't seen very much. The other thing is talking about how you can reframe dispute resolution in the workplace. And I think that's quite important in New Zealand, where we've had a dramatic shift from collective into individual dispute resolution, where we've had a dramatic shift. The other thing that has been important is that we have seen managers, and David Nash was talking quite a bit about him, that they are having a major impact on what goes on in dispute resolution in workplaces. Normally, when you talk about New Zealand dispute resolution, you talk about the employment institution and their dispute resolution, because we've had dispute resolution and particular employment institution for nearly 130 years in New Zealand, and they are doing a lot of cases. We talk tens of thousands of cases each year. A little bit like ACAS, but of course we have a longer tradition in New Zealand. There has been in that area quite a bit of discussion recently about access to justice, just like there have been in Australia, Ireland, and other places. But it is certainly something that we are looking very much on, partly because we have had, as part of the neoliberal experiment in New Zealand, a lot of low-paid employees, and they, of course, think that exit, as Julian was talking about, is easier than actually pursuing their rights through the formal institutionalized system. The other thing is that in 2010, 2020, we had a massive increase in immigration, So we've had a lot of new immigrants, and they seem to have a reluctance to use any kind of dispute resolution things. So this has dominated what we are discussing in New Zealand. But what we're actually talking about here is a sort of parallel system that goes on in the workplace. And when we started this, we were not quite sure what the figures look like, but we recently had some new big surveys coming out. And it seems like there is very much a legalistic approach dominating amongst employers. And you have to understand, in New Zealand workplaces, employers really decides to a large degree how they're gonna deal with their, what we call employment relationship problems in the workplace. So we are looking at that parallel system, and when we look at the figures, the recent figures that comes out, it is much bigger than actually the institutionalized official system we are talking about. In fact, it is much, much bigger. So we're trying to put some focus on this, and we have done that for quite a while. And what we're trying to do is trying to see what is it the people that are involved in workplace disputes are talking about in their disputes. And we find that complex issues and understandings are normally overlooked. Let me see. And why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because the legalistic approach means that a lot of employers, as a default, will go for a legal approach and a problem-solving approach, which in their case is make sure you don't get into employment disputes. And that often leads to very legal, cumbersome processes in the workplace. And it quite often leads, as the new figures are telling us, that the employee will be divorced, no longer in the workplace when that process is finished. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to talk about what is it they're doing and using sense-making theory to get a new frame. And thank you, Julian, for talking about frames of reference, to get a new frame, reframing what they are doing here. And we find that quite often the surface issue that you deal with when you are dealing with an employment relationship problem really links into a whole lot of other major things underneath that are very important. So that's the first thing. The second thing is by getting people to talk about these things and acknowledging and communicating about these problems in a different way, you actually get much closer to a solution at the workplace, which is really in line with what our current legal framework is talking about. So we're using that to partly trying to get the parties to talk with other things. So we're using it in practical dispute resolution processes in the workplace. We're also using it to teach, and that's really the last point on that OA, to teach mediators in the official system to try to do slightly different things and try to have a more what probably in other countries will call an ADR and a communication process. And
you've had 7 minutes.
We are now using that. Yes?
You're at 7 minutes, Erling.
7 minutes. We are now using that in our teaching. So we're teaching managers, union leaders, and workplace representatives about how you can communicate and talk differently about these problems. In that case, we hope to avoid escalation in the workplace, and we hope to avoid a more legalistic process, because quite often when the lawyers are in there, it means that there will be a separation of interest between employer and employee, and quite often the employee will leave. Finally, we are trying to get that in, as I said, moving on what we call a settlement focus, and thinking more about the process that are in there. And by reframing and sense making and talking differently about workplace employment relations problems, we hope that we are getting closer to something that is more aligned with a rather lofty aspiration of our current legal framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erling. And without further ado, if you would be able to load your slides, Katrina, from Cornell. Last but not least of our presenters. Take it away, Katrina.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can see them beautifully. Thank you.
Great. So as Greg said, my name is Katrina Nobles. I'm the Director of Conflict Programs in the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution, as well as a PhD student at the ILR School at Cornell University. I'm joined by my colleagues Ariel Avgar, a professor and associate dean for outreach in the ILR School at Cornell University, and Ryan Lamar, the Ruben G. Soderstrom International Labor Professor at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So just a couple of things. One, we are focusing largely our chapter on the non-union setting in the US, primarily because approximately almost 90% of the workforce is in the non-union setting. With over 40 years of research, the promise of ADR in the non-union setting has long been to offer a powerful tool that delivers employee voice and justice. But there's some current reality challenges to this notion. So a few of the things we're focusing on are the historical context of tipping points. Are we at a tipping point right now? For instance, the nature of conflict is changing, the nature of work is changing, and then all of these sort of combined have major impacts on the field of ADR. So we ask, are we in a unique moment that begs the question, is this system still relevant? So, historical tipping points. Over the last 40 years, we've seen a rise in the use of ADR in the non-union setting. Particularly in the 1990s and since, we've seen a massive increase in systems designs for organizations around integrated conflict management systems, where there's a coordination of multiple ADR processes. Today, we're also seeing that there's an historic culmination of social events causing a palpable drive toward a tipping point yet again. Obviously, this has been talked about in the other presentations as well. This includes things like the pandemic, which is showing biologic, social, and economic impact, similarly to other places globally. And then also major civil unrest. In particular, we see major civil unrest around Black Lives Matter, as well as human rights more broadly. So the question here is, has ADR fulfilled its promise of delivering employee voice and justice? And in the current climate, is it a force for positive change in the workplace, or is it primarily preserving the status quo? So first, if we look at the changing nature of conflict, we're seeing a lot more collective issues emerging. So things that are happening intra and intergroup, if we're talking about the levels of conflict that span beyond a single organization. So movements, for instance, social movements. And this is rather than individual. So the more intra and interpersonal conflicts that we may traditionally see in the workplace. Our dispute resolution approaches largely cater to individual conflicts within the non-union setting. And so as we see more collective issues coming up, especially across multiple organizations, we're not seeing the dispute resolution approaches to address those. And the sources of conflict have expanded within the workplace as well. So we're seeing a lot more value and identity conflicts rather than the more traditional transactional based issues that might arise in the workplace. We're also seeing that the nature of work is changing. So if we look at the diversity of employment arrangements, that can include location, whether we're talking about remote, hybrid, in-person, as well as the type. So are we talking about permanent employees, independent contractors, gig workers? We're also seeing decreased employee longevity. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to the psychological contract at work. We're also seeing employee expectations regarding value alignment and advocacy. So workers kind of collectively asking employers or demanding of employers that they are public about sort of values and that they align with their employees. A recent example of this is around voting rights, for instance. And then the psychological contract in the context of traditional workers. So if we're thinking about those workers that are permanent employees, primarily, the psychological contract at work has traditionally focused on workplace commitments. So for employees, that's job security, pay, mobility within the firm or the organization. For employers, that's effort levels, commitment and attachment to the organization, loyalty, citizenship behavior. And obviously, when we see a decreased employee longevity, we know that that psychological contract is changing. Studies on the psychological contract at work shows that since the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, there's a new contract that's emerged focused on a relaxing of employment security and a shift of employability security. So it's breaking the ties between employees and employers, creating a more transactional relationship. So what's the impact on the field of our non-union ADR? A closer examination of diversity in the field by parties and providers is kind of coming up more publicly, more broadly recently. So recent surveys have shown that a high percentage, over 90% of workplace arbitrators and mediators are white, and about 80% are men. This has shown up in multiple surveys that we've seen. And current cases have highlighted this even further. So a couple of examples of that. The Me Too movement had been calling for public and transparent resolution for sexual harassment matters, for instance. And Jay-Z's search to identify more Black arbitrator candidates for his arbitration case in 2018 highlighted the lack of diversity on arbitrator panels. An array of workplace systems, practices, and processes are simply not capable in their current form to address the changing nature of conflicts too. I talked a little bit about the changing nature of conflict kind of becoming individual to collective. So more collective conflicts are coming up with more social movements. They happen across organizations. And the systems that we currently have in place, ADR systems we certainly currently have in place, are not really at a point to address those.
So 3 minutes maximum to go. Please.
Thank you so much, Greg. So we're in a unique moment that calls for the reimagining of our theories and practices. So perfect timing. Our conclusions, our major questions at this point are: what comes next? Is there room for reform of the current system? Or should we be reconsidering how voice and justice are provided altogether in the non-union setting? And with that, I will yield my time, Greg.
Thank you very much, Katrina. And now we have a distinguished discussant from FMCS, Javier. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. So what I would say is that my thoughts are all over the place. I thought that some of the comments that you all had were absolutely fascinating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit on just like one or two items from each of yours, and then just broadly talk about what Katrina kind of made my head explode a little bit with the question of, is the system still relevant? And when you think about that, it's a scary question to really dig into. But I have some comments on that. So when David was talking about ADR systems in general versus being for reactionary versus strategic purposes, I thought that was an interesting look at that. And I would add, or as a requirement, right? Because, which is a little bit different, because I sometimes see folks adding these dispute systems in there as a way to avoid unionization, right? Or because it's mandated on them. I see mandated like from a board or leadership that they need to have some type of a dispute system in there. And then does the system really work because it's a required element versus more of a strategic element. And as far as strategic goes, we're actually seeing an uptick over the last year and a half of requests for ombud services, which I would put very much into the strategic category. It's fascinating because of the potential that of having ombuds as that central place for people to go and then kicking out the dispute to any other place, whether it be a more formal structure through an EEOC formalized process, or informal, just having a discussion with the two folks. But it's a one-stop shop for people to go to. And then Julian, your point in your slides about the role of media, whether it be mainstream or social media, and I do think that has a significant impact on that transition from individual to collective actions. And this has been going back. I did a quick Google to see when like coworker.org started. They started in 2013, so almost 10 years ago. Coworker.org came in, so that way individual problems could find folks who had similar issues and band together and deal with that. And I think the thing that, at least in the US, that really put this whole idea of collective action front and center was when the entire Virginia education system, the teachers were picketing on the on their Capitol to demand better wages and working conditions. And that was a collective action. Now, they weren't working through organized labor, but that was back in 2019. But all of that comes from the use of social media, right? So I thought those were some interesting takes there on that transition from individual to collective. Let's see. Erling, as far as the preventative side, or having more dialogue as opposed to these formal structures, kind of like they're having their day in court. In the U.S., there are the use of grievances processes, and we've seen that in federal mediation when we're mediating some of these disputes, that many times the issues are resolved without a formal settlement. Right? They had an opportunity to have their day in court. They were heard. They had an opportunity to have that discussion with the person that they had the problem with, and it becomes very effective to resolve the matter. So I like that, to hear that you're exploring these ways for people to open up the dialogue. Katrina, like I said, your question on the system is it still relevant? And I think you're focusing on the non-union pieces. But I would put the question on both, right? In the unionized structures as well as the non-union structures. And that was some of the discussion that Koken was having with his panel earlier that I thought really deserves digging into. And I had this situation. I was talking with somebody in the administration. I won't say, it was pretty high within the administration. And I don't know if you all remember, but there was an instance not too long ago with Netflix, where some of a large chunk of their employees walked out because of some of the programming that was airing on Netflix. That was a disruption to commerce. And the thought that I put forward to this person was, why aren't we, FMCS, helping out with that dispute? Right? and there's a lot of questions that come up behind there, and I know why, right? Because it's a very complex thing, but it's not a formalized product. Like, who do I go and have that comment or discussion with, right? Because you don't have that lead representative. That's probably the biggest barrier in there. But we have to have those conversations, and that's what I was really excited about with Katrina's question and the discussion that we had in Koken's session. So I will tell you that we are having these similar discussions that were in this panel at FMCS. I like to say that we're in a growth industry. There's no shortage of conflict, right? I like to say that I want to try to put myself out of business. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? I don't see that happening. But when I started over 30 years ago I would say in this arena, how do disputes look today and what it takes to get things resolved look different than they did 30 years ago. And I am in the process of even revamping how our mediators operate. We're switching from transactional engagements to systemic interventions, right? So that way we're going in there, we're seeing what are the problems, doing a full assessment and figuring out what's the program that's needed. And it's multiple approaches. It could be a formalized system like a grievance process. It could be opportunities for facilitated dialogue. It could be process for interest-based problem solving, collaborative problem solving. All of these, depending on what the situation, what's the best approach, and what can we do as an agency to help walk them through that process. So I'm glad
Javier,
to see.
Could you wrap up, Javier? So,
Final comment. I'm glad to see that we're having these discussions, and I hope we involve not just academics and not just labor, but we need to bring more of the management side in on this, because I could see where some of those barriers are, but we need folks from management engaged in these dialogues. So thank you all.
Thanks for your insights, Javier. Much appreciated. And we've only got about 10 minutes, so I'm proposing to invite 2 or 3 questions maximum and ask the speakers to keep a note of them, and then give all the speakers a chance to respond however they wish to the discussant or to any of the questioners. Please keep your comments and questions very brief. Does anyone wish to? I can see, did you have your hand up, Ariel?
No, I was expressing appreciation to Javier's.
Okay, thank you.
I have a guess that Joel's going to ask a question.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
Thanks, Ariel. So a common theme across all the comments and Javier's comments as a discussant is that there are more stakeholders in the conversation than the institutions traditionally contemplated. Community, others of various kinds. And I guess my question overall is, imagine it's 10 years from now, what would institutional arrangements look like that employed all the tools and methods that we know, but that were accommodating of many more stakeholders in the conversation? You know, in a sentence or two, could you paint a picture of, you know, what things could look like in a decade if we were to make progress in addressing the issues that you've all highlighted?
Well, thanks, Joel. And perhaps I can follow that.
Simple question.
Thank you, Joel. And perhaps I can add to your question, picking up Julian's comment about the role of the state. Julian was suggesting the role of the state has been often neglected in our field here. And keeping in mind there have been changes of national government in the US, Australia, and not that long ago in New Zealand, and that in Wales you have a government of a different complexion in the Principality compared with at the national level. Any observations on the role of the state in regard to dispute, conflict, settlement systems, please, from any speaker? And we've got time, I think, only now to go to their speakers to respond, and we'll start with Erling because I can see his hand up.
I see Ashley has a hand up as well.
I beg your pardon, Joel?
Does Ashley have a hand up? Yeah.
Quickly, Ashley, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand there. Thank you, Joel. You go, Ashley, briefly, and then we'll go to all the speakers.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. I actually had a question, so I don't know if it's appropriate for me to interject now or if I should wait until speakers have the opportunity to respond
You
first.
go ahead, Ashley, now, please.
Sure. I think it's kind of related to this conversation about the role of the state not being a neutral actor. Obviously, the state is also influenced by deregulation and regulation. So then their ability to respond depending upon regulations that I'll say in America have been in challenge more recently, which will influence their ability to be able to show up in these spaces. So my question relates to have speakers thought about the experience of the country's integration with ADR or acceptance of ADR as a legitimate form of redress? About the experience of the country's integration. Oh, sorry, I don't know. Could you hear me?
Ashley, maybe, did you pick up Ashley's question, everyone? Okay, people are nodding.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
I just wanted to know what folks is understanding, because I was saying the US ADR is not necessarily fully integrated. It's very much a piecemeal flash in the pan, depending on your state, which will then impact what that actually looks like in terms of access and availability of the service, and how that shapes your research. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ashley. And now I'm going to invite all of the speakers to respond in the reverse order. So Katrina, that will be starting with you, if you're happy to kick off. And again, we've only got a few minutes, 5 minutes to wrap, please.
Sure. So just a couple of things to go back to Joel's question first. I think first of all, in terms of kind of reimagining and thinking about what it might look like in 10 years, we would need to consider tools that can work beyond, between, and outside of the traditional boundaries of organizations, right? Because one of the big things that we're seeing are particularly social identity, value concerns coming up, and collective action that goes across actors that are across multiple organizations. So it would have to be something that would incorporate that. And then I think also, I would say to Ashley's question, I think one of the keys is a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? That brings into question the accessibility of
I think
systems.
one of the systems.
So with that said, I think we need to have more rigorous research understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion within the field, as well as how that impacts accessibility. And that includes structuring of the systems, right? Because it could be systemic issues that are present that are tamping down the accessibility aspect.
Thank you, Katrina. And Erling, brief response from you, please, if you wish. And you're on mute, Erling.
Sorry, I don't think the role of the state is in dispute in New Zealand. We've had the role of the state in this area for 128 years. They have been very important all the way through. And we have a huge amount of people involved here, a huge amount of cases going through. I think what we're really looking at is how this system can serve people better, which is really the access of justice angle. And we're also looking at how, and I think that what Ashley's question is a bit about, how we can have different types of processes and different types of people that can come in and deal with other things. So for example, we have a particular relationship with Maori as the traditional owners of the land, and we now run particular processes for them that are different from what we do in the mainstream. And we are now separating out a whole lot of processes in that area. I think what I find quite interesting with Javier's comment was, yes, we can see that the role of mediators, the role of the processes we see are changing, but we still have a difficulty actually finding out how much they're changing, because most of those processes are confidential. We can't actually go in and talk with them. We can talk with the individual mediators and through them get a sort of insight to what goes on, but we can't actually look at mediation cases as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Erling. And Julian, if you would like to come off mute, if you have any closing observations.
I'm responding a little bit tangentially. What was in our heads working on this is that the role of the state seems to be taken for granted in much of US academic scholarship, depending on where you look, of course, but within our field. And when I think about it, I think about the growth, the role of the state in Australia. It's much as Erling said in New Zealand, but what's notable in Australia is that the demise of unions has meant that there's been a shift in dispute resolution from tribunal-based processes to more informal, or if you like, workplace-based processes of resolution. We don't know exactly who's involved. We don't know exactly what standards are adhered to. The private practice of dispute resolution in Australia isn't subject to a widely accepted or well understood frameworks.
Thank you, Julian. And David.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think similar trends to what Julian just said. I mean, the state in the UK has had a long-standing opposition to litigation as a way of solving disputes, and have promoted, non-tribunal based resolution practices, to the extent that they introduced fees for employees, instigating tribunal cases in 2013. These were later declared illegal by the Supreme Court a few years later on the basis of access to justice. But there hasn't been a concomitant kind of promotion of ADR. And so ACAS, our public dispute resolution body, although it's funded by government, and that funding's been cut along with many other parts of the public sector under austerity, and ACAS almost has to be kind of revenue generating. It has to be kind of, has to hold its own. It doesn't get sort of extra sort of support from the state in that sense. We have seen an emergence of a sort of private mediation industry, which is relatively a new development here in the UK. So, but again, like Julian, we don't fully understand yet kind of who exactly is involved in that. But there are bodies like, various consultancies and a lot of labour law firms are offering services in this area as well. And then finally, just to pick up on one of Javier's points about the anti-union motivation, yes, our survey did pick up in a minority, but still kind of a quite strong minority of cases that they actually stated in black and white terms that kind of, having choosing a particular conflict management strategy was aligned to or linked to trying to prevent union influence in the organization. So yeah, it does seem to be a union replacement kind of strategy for some employers.
Well, thanks, David. And I crave the indulgence of Lyra to allow Javier, if he wishes, to say a few closing comments as well.
I would appreciate that, because I wanted to hit on the two questions from Ashley and Joel, and this will be very brief. As far as the state goes, it would be nice if they would have more formal, less formal structures, and that would be faster, right? So that way people don't have to go and get the attorneys to represent them, but that the resolutions have a binding element, right? So it quicker, less formal, more binding. That's one. And then Joel, 10 years from now, this is so complicated because I think we need to seek greater ways to collaborate. I had an issue where there was a police negotiations and we were asking community was trying to get involved in those negotiations. So do we collaborate with community relations services from the Department of Justice, FMCS, obviously the city, the union, but then holy cow, the time that's going to take to do all that. You ever hear what's a camel? It's a horse by committee. You get a bunch of people together and it becomes more and more difficult to reach a resolution. But that's where technology comes in, where MIT, it has this, they call it a hearth, where they put this in the center and they listen to the dialogue and they extract what were all the points from the different people, which also help increase the speed. So I think you get more people involved, have quicker conclusions by using technology, and allows us to collaborate. So the technology is out there. We just have to figure out a way how to use it in the real world.
Thank you, Javier. I wish we had more time. There are some interesting comments in the chat. I'd commend to you by Ashley and Ryan and Alex. And it just remains for me to say thank you to you all. I think we've had a very interesting and worthwhile session. And I'd also like to thank those behind the scenes, not only those on the stage, but also this wouldn't be possible without the hard work of the key LIRA people behind the scenes like Emily, Bernadette, Mike, and so on. And also this panel was co-sponsored by the International and Comparative Employment Relations section and the Dispute Resolution Interest Group as well. So thank you very much, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you in person next year at LIRA, all being well. In the meantime, we've still got some interesting sessions for this year's LIRA. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Cheers.
Thanks for
Good.
sharing, Greg.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Many thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Good on you. And thank you for getting up very early in the morning, Julian, in Melbourne, and those of us in the UK, David, very late at night here.